The second example of what I've been seeing that I really didn't have a negative experience like that with, but I watched the dialogue and, I commented on a few things and I didn't get anything like a nasty response or whatnot. But this argument about Robert Briefold and Briefold's law, and whether Briefold's law is based more on biology or a gynocentric culture. And this is a raging debate, guys, that I've seen for days going on Twitter. I don't know how long it had gone on before this point, but there's this raging debate among the MRAs that at least were part of this discussion. Right? I'm not saying that exemplifies all MRAs, and I'm going to get to that point later. But there was this debate about whether, Robert Briefold's a clown. Robert Briefold was just making observations about the animal community. And Robert Briefold didn't know crap. So why should you think Briefold's law is a thing? When who cares who Robert Briefold was? Who cares whether in a system that was more functional, we could probably mitigate Briefold's law, along with hypergamy and some other things that are, in my view, based on female biology largely. But that's not the society we have. And the reality is that women don't care about the men that they're in relationships with. They care about what those men can do for them. And that is the essence of Briefold's law. Whether Briefold was a simp or a moron or was only observing the animal community, or whether maybe it is more based on a social construct than biology. Let's just assume that that's the case. Is this society going to become less gynocentric anytime soon? Or ever, probably? No. So Briefold's law is in full force. How do I know that? 2/3 or more of divorces are initiated by women. If women didn't only care about men for what those men do for them, and we know that not all these men are abusive or bad people, then why would divorces be initiated by women so much more often than men? Because women only care about what men do for them, and as soon as they think they can do better, or society tells them that that man's not good enough, here come the divorce papers. Does that happen in all of those cases? No, but that's one of the main reasons, clearly, in my view it's clear, why over 2/3 of divorces are initiated by women. It's obvious that Briefold's law is in full force and full effect when it comes to how it affects men in everyday life. So why do we care whether Briefold was a simp? Why do we care whether maybe it's more a result of culture? And this is still a raging debate. Why does it matter, though? And yes, in theory, you can talk about, if we could reverse gynocentrism and it's not as based on biology, then maybe we can make Briefold's law not really a thing. And maybe it's not so much a universal law as it applies to the circumstances here and now. Okay, I doubt that that's true. But so what if it is? It doesn't change the circumstances for men as they actually are in this society where women are looking for the bigger, better deal. They constantly think that the man that they're with is only good for what he can do for them. And women don't have any obligation to actually have any sense of loyalty to the man that they're in a relationship with. Again, Briefold's law is pretty much self-evident, or should be, to people that see where things actually are between men and women. I mean, you could argue that they're not that way, but then you have to be pretty much not observing what everybody has been talking about in the men's community for years. Women don't love you, they love what you can do for them. And that is the essence of Briefold's law, and it's clearly in full force. Why are we debating whether Briefold was this or that? Why are we debating whether it's based more on biology or a social construct? Why aren't we spending that effort on getting the message out to men so that men can make better relationship decisions for themselves instead of wondering whether Briefold's law is actually going to be applicable to their relationship? Instead of realizing that, yeah, most likely it will be, because if she finds a guy that can do more than you, wait and see what happens. Wait and see whether Briefold's law is in full effect. Unfortunately, most women tend to treat their men like that. Men and women do not love the same way. That's another way of putting the same thing. And you can involve hypergamy and all that in the conversation as well. But women love you, love in quote marks, mostly for what you do for them, whereas men love women for other attributes. Yes, there's still some sort of benefit, but it's not the same type of benefit of, oh, if you get sick, I'm going to leave you because I can find a bigger, better deal. That's why understanding Briefolt's law and the reality that most women will act on that basis, that's why it's so important. But to sit here and instead act like Briefolt's law may not be valid, that does a disservice to men. Arguing with feminists and women in general, for the most part, and a lot of men that have been captured by the feminist ideology, or even the men that are captured by traditional conservative ideology, for that matter, arguing with them over the issues that men face is a waste of time. And this goes back, of course, to the first example or argument that I mentioned. It's just clear to me that these particular MRAs are completely stuck in this mentality of playing politics, of arguing about irrelevant things, of not really necessarily saying things that are actually that relevant to men and actually getting men the information they need to make better choices for themselves. Now, MRAs as a whole still do that. Don't get me wrong. They still make good points and they still provide good information. But arguing with feminists is a waste of time, and I learned that to some extent the hard way years ago. Arguing with people that think that men just need to man up and do what they ought to do for the benefit of society or for women, or for the state, really, in a lot of cases, is not going to help. That's not going to be a useful argument for men to hear. Arguing about feminism with people that are not intellectually honest is a waste of time. And intellectual dishonesty is the bread and butter of feminism. You're not going to expose anything to them by pointing out that they're intellectually dishonest. That's a wasted effort. They're just going to continue to use the strategies that they've used to become the dominant gender ideology at this point, and to have been the dominant gender ideology for decades now. And so, you could make the case, I suppose, to be fair, well, this shows other people who are intellectually honest how full of crap feminism is, but this has been done to death, right? All you have to do is take a couple of minutes to talk about how the wage gap is an apples to oranges comparison, to talk about how men have no recourse in cases of domestic violence, where if he fights back, he's a wife beater or a woman beater, and if he lets the woman hit him, he's a pussy, and he has no place to go. All he can really do is cut his losses. And add in that women are guilty of domestic violence almost as often as men are. How often do you have to talk about reproductive rights and how the idea is that you need to advocate for women's right to abortion of convenience, even while men have no reproductive rights at all, to the extent that an adult woman in some cases can rape a teenage boy, get pregnant, and then when that boy turns 18, successfully sue him for back child support? How long does it take to have to put that information out there? How much time and energy do you have to dedicate into talking about what the family courts do? Look who gets sole custody. Look who still has to pay alimony for supposedly strong and independent women. How does having a system like this make sense, and feminists still want more for women even in these situations? How does that add up? And you can talk about gender roles. Gender roles are so skewed today that asking a woman to make you a sandwich or get you a beer is considered sexist, but expecting a man to pay child support for kids that he doesn't get to see and that may not even be biologically his in some cases, that's what a real man ought to step up and do, according to a lot of people. How long does it take to compare the suicide rates, the homelessness rates, and the lack of access to your own kids that men oftentimes are faced with, compared to manspreading, mansplaining, and the wage gap myth? How many times do you have to compare these things to see the relevance of, well, these are women's issues versus men's issues, to see that men are suffering more, to see that women have the upper hand when it comes to a lot of these things, and in society in general? If someone's intellectually honest and receptive to these things, it takes 2 to 3 minutes, like I just did right now, to describe these things for what they actually are. The problem is people don't care. The problem is, as an analogy that I've used a few times here already, it's like trying to go into a community of people that has no respect for animal rights and thinks it's okay to abuse animals, torture them, do whatever you want to them, and trying to get them to join PETA and just persuading them that that's what they ought to do with no actual consequences. They're not going to do that. They're just going to continue to do whatever they want to animals unless you have the ability to start throwing them in jail or fining them. They're not going to join PETA. They're just going to respond to the environment. They're not going to change unless they're made to change. Now, again, I'm not saying that the MRA case is completely hopeless. What I'm saying is that going down this line of thought process or trying to do things in this way pretty much makes what they're doing hopeless. If they're not trying to put information out there to men, and instead they're arguing about Briefolt's law, we're not going to get anywhere with that. If they're trying to argue with feminists, we're not going to get anywhere with that either. And frankly, to kind of conclude this video, I don't know whether I've changed a great deal since the 2010s. My thinking, my philosophy, whether it's developed or changed. I'm not saying I'm smarter now than I was then. Or whether the movement, the men's movement, has gotten that much more stuck since the 2010s. Because I know that they were always arguing about things with feminists and whatnot. But it seems like, at least with these particular people, these particular MRAs that I encountered on Twitter, that they're completely stuck in things that are completely useless to men at this point. Not because they don't have good intentions, but because arguing about Briefolt's law or trying to convince feminists not to be intellectually dishonest is a complete waste of time. It's not going to work because there's no incentive for it to work. There's nothing that's going to be a catalyst to get feminists to abandon what they've done and all of a sudden start to use reason and intellectual honesty. And by using some sort of new mechanism to show people that feminism's full of crap, you're not going to convince people that a simple argument like I just gave, 2 or 3 minutes long, talking about how things actually are for men, wouldn't work or wouldn't do as well. It's clear to me that these particular MRAs are foundationally different than where a lot of the MGTOW guys come from. And I will say that MGTOWs can also get stuck. They can endlessly talk about women in some cases. There are some MGTOW guys that will do that. There are MGTOW guys that will just say, all my problems are because of women. Women are all trash. Women are all exactly the same. None of them are good, right? They're all exactly hardwired to do specifically the same thing all the time. I believe that there is a biological mechanism for hypergamy and Briefolt's law and these types of things. And so women are hardwired to do the same things in many cases. But I do also believe that there is some variation. But the thing about it is, even those guys that endlessly talk about women, at least they're informing men that, hey, maybe you want to stay away from these kinds of women. Maybe you want to make a better choice for yourself than the choice I've made to have all these problems with females. At least there's that versus what I saw the MRAs doing in this instance, right? What I'm talking about with Twitter. Like, honestly, this is completely fruitless. In some cases, it's actually a detriment to men to get them to think that maybe Briefolt's law is not going to be applicable to the relationship that they're in. And so maybe, guys, I've changed. Maybe the movement has changed and become more stuck on that. Or maybe I just found a couple of MRAs that had those particular points of view. And maybe a lot of MRAs completely get what I'm saying. They realize that one of the best things they can do is give men information, and debating feminists is a waste of time, and acting like Briefolt's law is not applicable is probably not going to help men make better decisions for themselves. Maybe there's a lot of MRAs that realize that too. I don't know what the majority of MRAs think. I think it would be really difficult to assess that. But if this is where their movement is, if they're truly stuck doing these kinds of things, they're not going to succeed. Any remaining chance to have some level of success is gone if you're debating feminists and the merits and validity of Briefolt's law. And so I wanted to get on here and say this, because even though it doesn't give me joy to say that, I wish the men's rights movement had some chance to succeed. I definitely have moved more toward the MGTOW point of view over time anyway, but have my views changed so much that I expected to have a conversation about what it is that feminists are doing in terms of just using their sexuality and their femininity to get what they want, and to have that completely go over the head of the female MRA that I was talking to, who I know has been part of the men's community for a long time and has flat out said men should consider going their own way, and yet she's still so lost, in my opinion, right? This is my personal point of view, of course, when it comes to debating feminism or debating feminists themselves and trying to criticize what feminists do as intellectually dishonest. Of course it's intellectually dishonest. They've gotten where they are by being this way. Do you expect that they're going to improve on that? I mean, or that people are going to see that they're intellectually dishonest? I mean, that's been so obvious for so many years now, honestly. It is what it is. But I do think in conclusion that there is more of a gap, a foundational gap between some of the MRAs and their thought process and the sort of MGTOW point of view or perspective. It's just, if this is what the MRAs are doing, then their movement has no chance to succeed. And I don't say that in the sense of throwing shade at them or anything like that, but if they're not primarily focusing on informing men so that men have the opportunity to basically limit their involvement in a system that hates them and then withdraw their support as much as they can from that, whether they're literally going their own way or they still have, a long-term girlfriend, whatever their version at the individual level of withdrawing from the system may happen to be, if you're not encouraging men to put some sort of pressure on the system to actually change, and instead you're going to argue these kinds of points, and you're not going to realize that trying to play politics isn't going to get you anywhere, and you're talking about Briefolt's law somehow not being valid when it's obvious that women primarily only value men for what those men do for them today, I don't see how things are going to improve on that front. I don't see how the movement is going to lead to anywhere that actually helps men. And again, maybe that's a minority of the MRAs now, but it just seems to me like this gap was a lot larger than I thought, right? It's not just a difference in strategy, it's a difference of perception. And the idea that you can somehow convince feminists or women of anything. Or maybe on my end, I've changed a lot more than I realized, and it's just now sinking in after all of these years what Stardust and others said many years ago. Don't waste your time arguing with women and feminists. It's a completely useless waste of your time and resources and energy. And if that's going to be the mainstay, if that's going to be how to approach things, the feminists are just going to keep winning because they're just going to keep using irrational emotion, me based arguments from the point of view of the feminist woman, and things aren't going to get better. And so maybe I'm just now realizing all the consequences of that. But whatever the situation may be, I wanted to put out there that there's more of a difference now, I think, between the way a lot of MGTOW versus MRA people think about men's issues. And I still agree with 95% of what the MRAs say. But if they honestly think they can work within the system to change things in this way, then I honestly don't think there's much of a hope for change. And I definitely tend to have more of the men going their own way perspective on this at this point. If this is typical, debating Briefolt's law and arguing with feminists, a complete waste of time, then, I think there's more of a difference between that and men walking away from all this than I have actually anticipated or believed. And this isn't a good thing that this is the kind of point that's being argued, but again, maybe the better move is just to walk away from this type of dialogue altogether and focus on your own self-betterment.